Let's take questions and discussions. I can promise I'll take the questions. I can't promise answers though.
Thank you, Omar Qureshi. I think this is quite an enlightening paper that I have ever read so far with regard to this matter. Can we argue that this is the limitation of kalam and mantiq because they couldn't describe
This is a what?
the limitation.
Limitation.
The kalam and also mantiq because they couldn't describe the deeper understanding of the ontological status of this, the thing that we discussed just now, the concept, the universal concept. Because I think if we refer to Al-Jurjani, Al-Ta'rifat, he says that Al-Kulli that we discussed just now, it means Ismun lil Haqi Ta'ala. So it could also be, knowledge that, belong to Allah Ta'ala. So I think, I don't know, this is something that I would like to ask Dr. Omar Qureshi, whether this is, the answer would be possible if we were to, enter into a more deeper realm, especially among the Tasawwuf, among the Sufis, because they have this concept of A'yan Sabita, permanent archetype. So what permanent archetype means? Ia haqa'iq al-mumkinat fi ilmu haqq ta'ala. So meaning to say, the thing is already in the knowledge of Allah Ta'ala, in the mind of Allah Ta'ala.
Yeah.
Whether we can relate to that, because this is something that we intersect between philosophy and ultimately the higher tasawwuf.
Yeah. Does everybody understand what he was bringing up a lot? MashaAllah. Yeah, so what he was bringing up, Jazakallah khairan, for bringing this up, and is how does this relate to, so many schools of tasawwuf, especially from Sheikh Muhyiddin's time onwards, have affirmed what's called a'yanu thabita. And again, to translate that, we can talk about it. But actually, a good translation skips my mind right now. What would you suggest, Sheikh Jihad Jawad?
I was actually working on a comprehensive.
Yeah. See. So yeah, you said archetype. Okay. So we'll talk about why that's not an adequate and a misleading interpretation. Translation of this. But
even permanent too. And
permanent doesn't have
because thubut is a technical term here from kalam, and the idea is that it has subsistence, not that it's inchangeable. Permanent gives you the sense it's inchangeable, right? Immutable is unchangeable. But thubut
I use
simply,
affirm.
yeah. But so falling from thubut. But if you look at the technical uses in terms of subsistence, it means that it resides someplace.
Also immutable. Also immutable as the entities that exist in the divine knowledge.
Yeah, but that's a secondary meaning that doesn't come directly.
I came across that in some of the what term should we use for Western Islamic studies, because it's mean to say Orientalist.
Just what? Western Islamic studies. Academics. Yeah.
So a little bit of it's coming back. A few months back, I was doing some research on this. One, I was getting a feeling that the term is being used in different ways by different authors.
Yeah.
And mutable came up as a translation, I remember, and it didn't sit right with me. But it all depends on how we are employing this term.
Yeah, I know that.
But if I recall correctly, I'll see if I can pull up what I've got, but I have citations from a number of texts. But my understanding is that a'yan thabita are actually existent objects or something like this. Some authors. I could be.
They're as Sheikh Muhyiddin said that, he said a'yanu thabita ma shammat ra'ihat al-wujud. Meaning that, so
negative?
Yeah, negation, ma nafiya. Ma nafiya. Yeah. And meaning that, so let's translate for everybody, that these a'yanu thabita, these are entities, right? They exist in God's knowledge, meaning that they don't have extramental existence, concrete existence, we would say. And that's from Sheikh Muhyiddin. It's in the Fusus, he actually says that very clearly, Now,
you said where?
It's in the Fusus al-Hikam, he states that too. Now the question here is that, as it relates to our top question on universals, are the a'yanu thabita, these entities in God's knowledge, right? Are they universals? in a Platonic sense, in the sense we're looking at here. And I mean, when you look at how they're understood, these entities in God's knowledge, there's no way you could say they're universal. Although there are authors, such as like in the Imaginal Worlds by Chittick and all that, who present them as Platonic forms and universals. That's not a...
But Chittick does criticize that view. It's more, Toshiba Izutsu uses it more as a kind of a Platonic host, but in the mind of subsisting, not existing, in the mind of God.
Of God, yeah. But Chittick also affirms that he when he explains it though, he explains it as they function as universals, right? As in a Platonic sense. And if you look in his book in Imaginal Worlds, yeah, he talks about it there. And
perhaps the divine names function that way. I am from
yeah, that's a whole different conversation.
Coming out on
The
this.
ayah.
Oh, you do? Yeah.
I'm going to get slaughtered by that Quran.
But the ayana thabita are not universals in this sense of the word, or even a Platonic understanding. They don't function in that way, you know. And they have that's a whole different, that's a whole different ontology. But they do relate to us, right, as human beings. Like it's basically our ayn, you know, and how it kind of unfolds in God's knowledge. But that's, I wouldn't say that's definitely not universals in terms of a concept that the mind forms, right? And so that's what we're talking about here, and that is distinct from the ayn thabit or the ayana thabita. It's very distinct from those two, yeah.
The reason why they make a quick approximation with these A'yan Thabita being like universals is because they have to be abstract. And if they're abstract, even the term abstract is not accurate in the Arabic. This is this abstract concrete distinction is in the analytic tradition. It doesn't come from in Arabic. So even using these terms, it's because the A'yan Thabita, they're not. They don't have a manifest reality yet, but they subsist in the mind of God in a kind of Meinongian sense. You have to bring Meinong back.
Yeah.
So that's why they categorize as abstract, and the universals approximate.
Yeah, but it's hard to.
Correct, yeah, but
Yeah, it's hard because, yeah, we wouldn't say they're in the mind of God. We're saying God's knowledge,
Yeah,
right,
sure.
which is very different,
Yeah,
you
very
know.
different, yeah.
And God's knowledge is not like through abstraction. There's no necessary, there's no daruri, nadari. All those are categories of human knowledge or created knowledge, you know, and stuff. They don't.
How do I understand Tashku Brazadi's explanation just now? You read, this thing is subsisting in God's active knowledge. So does it explain the nature or the ontological nature of that? You know.
Yeah. Does he go into this? Not in this work, but I'm sure in some other works he might.
Pick up his Al-Wujud al-Dahni.
This is from that Risala. Yeah, it's a section on there where he talks about the intiza and stuff like that. Yeah. Oh.
So, I mean, I don't want to like push us in a direction you don't want to go to, but I'm just interested. I don't remember because I know I looked at the paper before. Do you kind of bring in conversations around ahwal and wujud al-dahni and how that impacts, you know, the position of somebody who does, for example, isbat ahwal, or wujud al-dahni might change in their kind of understanding of universals?
Yeah.
Even Abdurrahman Hayek has a paper on ahwal, and he calls them something like Islam's the natural Muslim understanding of universals or something like that.
You know, I mean, yeah, the ahwal are interesting. And you know that in the Ash'ari school, like there's many early scholars who did affirm them, and later, you know, there's a discussion on them where they took a different position. But, you know, it does raise a question for me, what exactly is the problematic nature of ahwal? So ahwal are early theologians, Ash'ari theologians would use these terms like states. So, you know, if you would say this person, you know, if you would say Tom knows something, or Tom knows, you know, himself, let's say. But then he would say Tom has this idea of he is a being that knows. And so they would call that, early theologians would call that a state, a hal, you know. And then they would say it doesn't exist, nor does it not exist. Yeah. Yeah. You know.
Beyond being and not being.
Yeah. But what they meant by it doesn't exist and not exist, it's, I mean, you know, because this is coming from a Mu'tazili theological tradition, they're responding to them, so one has to understand what they mean by existence and non-existence here. But yeah, it's been a debate, huh?
It's in fact the Mu'tazilites who make that claim, right?
It's not mental.
These are ahwal
Yeah.
and not attributes, for example.
Yeah, they're, well, not attributes, yeah. So when they say it doesn't exist, meaning it doesn't have extramental existence, but when they say it's non-existence, but they did say, you know, so yeah, they go into a whole debate on this, but in terms of, as it relates to your question of universals and stuff, I mean, no, that's something that I think I haven't looked into, but I've started to re-look at the whole issue of ahwal. And I've had some initial conversations like, you know, like, okay, what's really the issue here? But the shiuch I spoke to said, it's not that simple, Omar. Like, it goes, read Mu'tazili literature first, and then you'll see what Juwayni and others are responding to and why they took the position they did. And that'll give some more clarification. So I'm still at that stage of...
Do you think, like the similar question of wujud dhihni, do you feel like it changes, as I think Sheikh Jihad was pointing out earlier, like if some of this is being, you know, proposed by some folks who believe in wujud dhihni, are we just calling wujud dhihni mental existence? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to call it, but
Yeah.
the kind of position of mental existence, then does that going to impact how they view the universals they view?
Well, so that's a good question. And I'm not sure if it'll impact it or not, but when they say the essence forms, I think the question is what is that essence that forms? I think that's where it'll have an impact. That is that essence identical to the object, you know, or is it not? But in terms of predicating universality of it or not, you know, I don't think it'll impact it in that sense, you know. Yeah, but in terms of what the essence is that's being universality has been predicated of, then I think, yeah, it would have some difference there, yeah.
Can you go back and elaborate a little bit about Ibn Sina's position again? So the idea that it exists not as a universal.
Yeah. That's been pretty consistent of the philosopher, the Mutakallimin, the Mu'tazilas, and Ash'ari, like
so
only particulars exist extramentally, yeah.
So in terms of his position then, when he says that the Kulliyat Tabi'at fil Kharij is
Mawjud.
Ayn Wujud, al-Juz'iyat, how do you parse that?
So that was going to be my question as well. When so now that, did I miss the discussion on?
No, we just brought this point up.
It didn't go on while I stepped out for a moment because he said there's going to be a whole lot of discussion. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Further.
When we're talking about the natural universal,
yeah.
The extramental natural universal, the existent natural, the natural universal existent. What are we talking about? This came up last night in the car. It was just you and I in the car last night.
That's how I remember it.
So to feed into all of this, but were we? To feed into all of this, what I was gleaning, and Dean pointed out some important things to understand the way we describe this, but what I was getting from my readings and lead up to this was that there is a discussion of the properties that are in a given particular that are similar enough to the properties in any other particular that enable us mentally to put them in the same category. So the terminology we use to discuss this is extremely important when we're talking about similarity, and if that's the case. I'm going to expand on this.
Yeah.
Right, because we could find ourselves stuck in Wittgenstein's family resemblances or something like that if we're too cavalier in the way we describe it. My big question is this: what are we dealing with when we're isolating and analyzing that natural universal to the Kharij?
I mean, here...
And how does the similarity issue of properties, you know,
Yeah.
I think this is one of the, a fundamental point that would be helpful.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's an important question. And it does relate to, I mean, pretty much everything. It's fundamental to the questions of how do we group things together and on what basis are we grouping things together. So, you know, like if we're gonna say everybody in this room is a human being, what are we saying when we state that? Is it just that, what do we have in common when we say everybody in this room is a human being?
And is hayawan nata, rational animal, sufficient for that?
Yeah. So yeah. So are we saying everything we share? Like what is it that groups us together? Is it just the term human? I'm just saying you're a human being. You're a human being. Oh, I've called these people human beings. The term.
Ensoulment.
Yeah. Is all that we share here is my basis of grouping us together just the word human? They would say no. You know, anomalists will say yes. You know, extreme anomalists, you know, would say yes to that, you know, question.
Why does the extreme nominalist say yes? Because it's, for them, the application, the way word, is it usage?
Well, so it has to do with what does that term signify? So, and again, it depends on what school of nominalism we're talking about, but certain interpretations of someone like William of Ockham, for example, would say that, you know, does the human being form a concept? Does it form this essence of a thing? Is that something that the human mind
Engineers.
Yeah, and is there a process of abstraction that takes place? So many interpretations of Ockham would say no. So what does this word horse, what does this word human refer to then? And as you can see here, for pretty much Avicenna and all the theologians that we looked at, the term horse or human, what does it signify? So if I say human, does it signify you, the object? Or does it signify what's in the mind? Or does it signify anything? So for our theologians, the word signifies the concepts in the mind, not the particular object.
So then we call that masala.
Correct. Yeah. So the word human will signify the concept in the mind, and the concept in the mind is formed from the particular. You see?
So it abstracts it from the particulars, the concept is formed.
And then we have the word,
Articulates it.
which corresponds to the concept, not to the particular. Now, in certain readings of William of Ockham, there is no concept that forms. So what does that term refer to? Well, it's predication now, only.
Linguistic predication.
Linguistic predication, and therefore, so what holds you all in common? We would say it's, why am I even predicating human of everybody in this room? And why am I grouping you all together? It's not due just to the term, it's due to the concept, which is derived from my perception of you, and that concept is formed from the essence. Yeah, it's coming from that. So I'm grouping all of us together as human beings because we all possess the same essence, not just the term that we share in common in our usage and our predication. There's a big difference, right, between that.
So the key difference would be, how does it relate then to the essence of the object?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the essence of the object is what we form in our concept after abstraction, and then we have the term, the word, right? In anomalous conception, you know, not to use that word confusing, but anomalous understanding, let me put it that way, it's kind of I think I phrased it in this way, which is, yeah. So I said here is that so here's what William Ockham says. The universal is not some real thing having a psychological being, he's negating that, in the soul or outside the soul. It has only a logical being in the soul and is a sort of fiction, having the same sort of entity in the logical realm as the external things has in the psychological realm. Universals, according to this school, are terms. You see, for a nominalist, universals are terms. And that's why I said earlier, pay attention, universals for Avicenna and for us are applied to concepts, not terms. So according to this school, universals are terms which do not signify something common externally, right? But are universals in the sense terms are being predicated of many. So it's not a concept which is predicated of many, it's terms which are predicated of many. In Akam, these concepts are no longer objects of thought, but are collapsed into the cognitive act itself. And we are left with terms which signify a collection of objects rather than a universal idea in the mind. That's a very different psychology, right? Is what we're saying here. And these are, again, these are more common interpretations of Akam. There's some other interpretations like, no, he actually does believe before, and I'll leave that to the specialists of Akam's thought to determine, right? But you know, there is a fundamental difference here. You know, what's going on psychologically, which informs different positions on universals in that sense. Yeah. There was a question?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So now, to relate the kulliyat tabi'i to kulliyat aqli. So kulliyat aqli becomes formed from that kulliyat tabi'i. I mean, it takes its form. I'm just trying to tease it out.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what
Correct. Yeah.
happens from the kulliyat
Yeah.
tabi'iyya.
And so
Perception in our mind of
yeah.
kulliyat takes place.
So when we say, like, if you look at this exemplary, if we say animal, al-haywan kulli, if we say that in Arabic, right? Animal is a universal. Animal, right, is the kulli akli, and then kulli, and then universal is the kulli mantiqi. When those two combined, right, is where you get animal as a universal, right? Yeah. Now animal qua animal though, that's the kulli tabi'i. Yeah. Animal qua animal, or al-haywan.
Kulliyat start, in essence. I mean, the ontological beginning is the kulliyat tabi'i.
Because prior to that you have animal, the concept animal, and the concept universal. Then what you do in your mind is then you're going to predicate it. Animal is a universal.
Right.
You see, so that's why universality, particularity, existence, non-existence, all of these things are after the conception, the formulation of an essence.
And that conception is formed from the kulliyat, from the supposed kulliyat.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. So,
I have a question
yeah.
on what where Omar is going. Because you talked about a circuit. Omar. Oh, Omar. Right? Omar too. You talked about a circuit. So there's the intiza, the abstraction.
Correct.
And that abstraction becomes the kulliya aqliya.
Well, it'll become an mahiyah then first.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So the mahiyah comes from the process of abstraction.
Correct.
And then it becomes masada. I mean, from the mind, now it becomes the masada of this mahiyah concept.
Yeah, the external object?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
So,
yeah.
when is it kulli tabi'i? When is it the natural universal? Prior to abstraction, or after the mahiyah is now extended, after extension?
Abstracted and stuff, yeah.
And we're saying here is the cognate of the mahiyah in the mind. Is that one is called natural universal, or prior to abstraction?
It's going to be after the act of abstraction.
You see?
After the act. Because it...
After.
Yeah.
So he's saying it starts from the natural universal.
Right.
What I'm getting is that yes, but also here we have a particular or an instantiation or an object. It only is properly referred to as natural universal after
abstraction.
it comes back as masada.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
So that would be a modification.
Yeah.
So it doesn't start from kulliyat tabi'i, it starts from the object.
The particular.
And now, after this circuit, it's now referred to as kulliyat tabi'i, as the correspondent, even though it is the source.
Okay.
But maybe we need to be more specific.
Yeah,
to
yeah.
thinking.
Because it's haywan min haythu huwa, that only develops after intiza. Min al-juz'i fil kharij.
The
Yeah.
other thing that helps us
Yeah.
with this too is that if we are doing the circuit, and I don't know if that's the right way to approach it, but object process, now we refer to that object as the mass sadaq of the mahiya.
Correct.
Extrapolated.
Correct, yeah.
We refer to it as kulliyat tabi'i.
Correct.
So, I know I'm interrupting people. What are the aspects, so I'm avoiding properties, what are the aspects of the object that enable, make possible that intiza, and then now referring to that as the kulliyat tabi'i? What's going on there?
Yeah.
And that's where we started out is, are we saying that there are properties, observable or intelligible properties in this object that not only enable the extrapolation, abstraction, but are similar enough to other objects that we can also assume that they all have the musharaka,
Yeah.
right, under the kulli.
Yeah.
Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, so what's happening here is, yeah, when you observe an object here, first of all, they'll maintain all we really observe are properties. In reality, like so when we
We
observe.
want chapter and verse too. You've got to.
Okay.
I know that you understand this.
Yeah, sure.
But are you finding that the authors are the imams, that's how are they describing this?
Yes, yeah.
I read it in a few places,
Yeah.
but I can't.
Yeah, in the sense that when like you're observing me, we're observing each other. If we were to identify what we observe, we're just observing properties right now, right? Now we have to. Now what happens in abstraction is we have to say, okay, we have a number of properties we see: height, hair color, right? And then we notice things like we're able to speak, we're able to think, we're able to
So
do.
a group of accidents.
Yeah.
Even before that, there's the umur amma. Right?
Yeah,
Food,
it exists.
wajib,
Yeah,
there's
you
the
exist.
umur amma
Correct.
we start with.
Yeah, that's true. Like you take
The general ontology.
general ontology. Yeah, there's all these properties. Now, what happens in abstraction is
Some being essential, some being some being merely essential to this
yeah.
category,
And then you get the awam.
and then you get the
Awadid, yeah. So we go through this whole thing of let's now, okay, what is it that is, what we will say later on is, what is it that are, what are those accidents or properties we see that are that we call essential, meaning here essential, they come about due to your essence. And what are those properties that are accidental in nature, that are meaning here, that are not due to your essence? So there's distinction between property and essence, right? So, property and accidents. The properties are those accidents, adad khas, that are due to, that we observe them, and you have these properties due to your essence. We haven't defined your essence yet, we're kind of in this initial stages. And accidents are those accidents that come about from you, that are not due to your essence, though. Okay? What's an example? Well, you can say something like the ability to breathe, right? You breathing is an accident. But is that specific to human beings breathing? No, right? Other animals, other life forms breathe. So that's an accident, it's not a property. Because
Well, it's like how many stomachs you have.
how many stomachs you have, your eyes, all of these, we make these distinctions. Now, what logicians are doing when they're saying all of these things is that they're studying human thought very deeply, like what's happening, right, when we're thinking, when we're undergoing all of these, what they'll call acts of the mind, right? So we're coming up with these. Now, abstraction here is to say, you are going to now separate properties or classify accidents, those that are what's called essential and those that are non-essential. And now you're going to focus on the non-essential, and you're going to focus on the essential, and then you're going to try to arrive at the essence then. And so abstraction is that whole process. Now the question here is is that, let's take it as an example. We've heard this many times, humans are rational animals. Do our scholars in fact maintain that rationality, right? Rationality and animality together, right, is the essence of human beings? In fact, no.
Okay.
Right? They would say that those are things that we see due to the essence of it. Even Aristotle will admit as much, and these are human efforts right now for us to articulate what we would see as essential properties, or what is the essence of human beings. However, what is causing the human being? What is it that allows for this being to be rational? That would be the human essence. So could we arrive at something beyond rationality, for example? Absolutely. Because these are human, when we say human rationality, our articulation of this idea of rationality is a human attempt. Now,
So are you getting at the fact that reason is a capacity of soul in the theology?
yeah, but reason,
So it's,
in our conception of reason, it's very rich. It's not just analyzing and reducing components, where reason has much more, can do much more than that, But when we say, for example, that the essence of a human being is, or we define a human being as a rational animal, this is a human attempt to capture the essence of a human being. Could it be wrong, or could there be something else that's other than rationality? In fact, yes, our scholars will say it is. That possibility is there. Now, we have to distinguish between our ability to articulate what the essence is and our knowing the essence of something. Because in fact, right, we are able to distinguish between, like a plant and a human. Even though we're not able to
not always.
Yeah. Well, even though we're not able to. Oh, they are? Okay, that's great. That's good to know. Yeah. Oh, now we got to do the whole lecture over again.
You just blew everything fall apart. I can't understand.
Yeah. So, even though we may not be able to articulate, what a plant is, in the sense of what's the essence of a plant, we as human beings know of what a plant is, right? And we're able to distinguish that from a cat, from a dog, right? From a human. And so when we say human beings are rational animals, that's a human effort to capture the essence,
But we don't rely on the rational property, animal property, to recognize someone as a human being, is what you're saying.
No, what I'm saying here is that, when you say, what is a human being, and we want to answer the question, what is the essence of a human being? Normally we say rational animal, right? I mean, most of the time it's used as an example, right? Not as to say that does in fact, rationality capture the essence of a human being. It may be rationality may be due to the essence of a human being, but do we identify it with the essence of a human being? Right.
So where do we go from there if we're saying that rational animal is not completely satisfactory? Where's it going to go from there?
What's the benefit of positing that then?
Well, then
The benefit, but what is more appropriate? Is there something more appropriate that is being suggested?
Yeah. So Aristotle does, for example, have things that he offers, as what captures the essence of a human being. And then there are scholars who do talk, Imam Ghazali himself talks about, very many things, that would, where it gets the idea that rationality is specific to human beings, but it's not the essence of a human being, though. And that's a very different way of looking at things. It's benefited me because, when you look at a lot of studies now, especially with evolution, right, it's a very different way of looking at natural things, right? Human beings, animals in general. And you do in fact find, levels of, based on experiments, you do find, and I know that some of them are questionable, but there's something to be said about intelligence in other non-human animals, right? And even levels of communication and perception of emotions too, and that is happening there. And it's very hard to say that there's not a level of rationality that's taking place.
That reason is not exclusive to the human being?
Yeah. Now, some conversation.
I mean, doesn't that depend on how we're defining?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm assuming we're working with the Islamic tradition here.
Waiting forever, but I just want to add something to that.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He's been waiting forever.
Oh, sorry.
Too polite, Oscar.
Remember, Sheikh Jihad said it's, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Sheikh Jihad said it's informal, right? Yeah.
Bogovich, interestingly enough, said it's not reason that distinguishes, it's morality that distinguishes humankind. That animals, you can have a super rational being, but they would have no morality, would be like a Frankenstein, for example.
That is also a question, evolutionary psychology.
Right. I'm just saying some people oppose morality as the distinction.
Yeah, because they find,
But
for
I
example,
just-
yeah,
I just wanted to throw that into.
they'll find like other beings being like this idea of altruism. They'll find it in non-human animals and things like that, and
Dolphins, like McIntyre uses dolphins.
Dolphins, yeah. McIntyre uses dolphins, yeah. But the idea here is that reason may be shared by human and non-human animals. But what someone like Imam Ghazali would say is there's degrees of reason. So it's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree that only human beings can obtain. And he'll say human beings' rationality is of a different degree, not a different kind. And what is it that's unique to humans, ultimately, in terms of what can they know with their intellects, is knowing God, experientially. And so it's not a degree, and it's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree, which is a very different conversation now then.
Also, the Quranic attribution of consciousness to beings in general, and things like that. Right?
Definitely complicates everything.
Conscious
Yeah.
depiction of the world.
So let's
Who was
pass
waiting
the
for a
floor
long time?
over
Was
to,
that you, or was it you waiting for a long time? Oh,
Oscar.
go. The floor is yours.
I'm going to pass the floor over to
Yeah.
Sayyidina Effendum. But I'd like Dean to jump in real quick on this, because philosophy of mind has a whole lot to say about reason as distinguishing consciousness and these types of things, as far as what is exclusive to the human being as opposed to something else. But if you have something to say on that, otherwise,
I was happy that you had nothing to say.
Oscar.
I just had this question in my mind about the how do we apply this discussion on universals and particulars on the question by starting from the question of existence, especially as it was discussed within the Islamic context. The discussion whether there are whether existence precedes essence or essence precedes existence, or whether existence is a predicate. The moment you say existence is a predicate, but you need to have something that existence can be a predicate of, then it appears to be
It assumes its existence.
right,
Yeah.
something has to exist to have existence
Yeah,
as a predicate. So then the
Yeah.
conclusion usually is that then existence is not a predicate.
That's Kant,
and then
right?
also go
Yeah.
to base like the whole discussion of we are possible beings. Why? Because in us existence and essence can be separated, not only in God, right? God is pure existence then, right? Wujud al-mutlaq, or just pure existence in God. So there's that, right? I mean, that as a quite powerful school. Wujudiyya is one of them. You can trace it back to people like Farabi, Ibn Sina. I mean, there are a lot of that. So, but the whole discussion on the universals and particulars appear to be based on the assumption that existence is a predicate. When we ask questions like whether universals exist outside of mind, and then all of that appear to take existence or start from, I think, or appears to function within a certain paradigm, which takes existence as a predicate. But what happens to that discussion when you start from when you go to the other direction and say existence then becomes essence, or existence is the something like Aquinas perhaps did in the Christian context, like existence this time is becoming your starting point, and this flower now is existence is becoming a flower. Flower is not taking existence as a predicate. So what happens to this discussion on the universal and particulars once you change that perspective and journey into that entirely different paradigm?
I mean, I know the paradigm, but I'm not well versed in it because, it's not my background and stuff like that. So I'm not able to speak about that. Yeah.
Which, again, that's again the Kantian, right? Criticism of the arguments of God. All of them almost is going back to that Kant's very insightful observation, which existed in the Islamic tradition for a long time, right? That existence cannot be a predicate. Then, his arguments are there too. That's something I'm working on nowadays. But it appears to me that this discussion should take that question seriously, I guess.
But so what Islamic precedents where they say that existence cannot function as a predicate?
It's not a predicate, cannot be a predicate. Even if it's a predicate, the reason behind it is that, as I just said, right, something to have existence as a predicate should exist in the first place. Therefore, if existence is not a predicate, and if we exist anyways, then what existence is then? The only solution appears to be, at least to certain people there, right, in that tradition, you can find it among the Ishraqiyun, right? So the Mullah Sadr appears to be going that way. Wujudiya as well, in the Arabian, people like Bonavi and Qaisari and others. Farabi is coming to a very similar conclusion. Ibn Sina is coming to, he says existence of predicate, but it's a special type of predicate. So, he kind of puts existence in a different place. And then the whole discussion appears to change. To me at least, I'm trying to figure out how to deal with that question of universals and particulars, but the humanness and redness. But these things, when we discuss them, whether they exist or not, again, we are intrinsically presuming that existence is a predicate, that these things are having that as a quality. But if not, then what happens?
But I don't think that's the question they're asking here.
But are we talking about the same issue of is existence a sifa?
Yeah.
Properly called a sifa?
As a predicate, yes. Yeah. Like what they're asking here is not whether universals exist, or they're saying what is the ontological status of universals? Which is very different. Which is very different than saying do they exist. You can ask that question. I'm not saying you can't. You can certainly ask that question.
The whole discussion, how with the particulars of.
Because the problem with saying God exists for Kant, why is that a problem from a Kantian perspective?
His criticism, critique of the arguments for God. Ontological argument, cosmological argument.
No, but he especially he especially addresses, right? You cannot use existence as a predicate for God. So you can't. So the statement God exists.
Doesn't add anything to the concept.
It does, because a predicate is supposed to inform you more about the subject,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And if existence is God, right? Then you say God exists. It's a tautology, basically, right?
Yeah, but
He's saying
Kant,
it's
again, is
tautological.
functioning within that paradigm of seeing existence as a predicate. It doesn't seem to be going into the depths of the question, though. My personal view, but he stops there. But it is precisely at that point Islamic philosophy appears to start thinking about metaphysics.
No, but even for so if you look at a text like Shahr al-Aqaid Nasafiyya, right? This question actually comes up when you say haqa'iqul ashya thabita. I won't.
You took all my fire today.
I won't take it. Yeah, I'll let him take it. But
Sit down and Metzen.
yeah.
Tomorrow to put
So how about we deal with that? I'll let him deal with it tomorrow.
Can I insert something really
Yeah.
quick? So just to kind of build up, I don't know if this is the way you were going, but
Yeah.
from my limited reading about the subject, isn't it true that sometimes this conversation does come up in the conversations around what I think Sheikh Jihad was just pointing to, whether the attribute of existence is something
truly
more than
an
the
attribute.
Right, exactly, truly an attribute or
Truly
not.
an attribute.
So then kind of the whole debate about Ash'ari's position saying,
Where does this rise
right,
from?
exactly, and we were reading recently in Sadr al-Shari'ah's book something very similar, him kind of defending kind of a similar position. And it seemed that the conversation...
Oh, I think. Are
It
you?
also seems to be that existence is a concept you cannot really get rid of, right? I mean, like, we are already functioning with an assumption that a universal at least existence.
No, it's what you're referring to, like the question of asalatul wujud, asalatul mahiyya.
Yeah. I mean, that's
But
sometimes.
Kant didn't say property in the bland sense, it's a determinative property. So that property, say AZ, where F is the property,
Yeah.
it has to enlarge the concept, it has to enlarge the subject. To put it in Aristotelian terms, the existence must classify an object, you can see. But for Kant, it doesn't do that because it doesn't add anything further.
When you say God exists, right?
Even to God, so if you pick God as a subject.
Yeah.
But
It doesn't amplify the subject in any, yeah.
Determinative property.
Yeah, yeah.
That's important in Kant. It's not just any old property is not an existence.
I mean, I'll let him deal, because like,
Yeah.
Taftazani deals with the whole thing, like, and he explains like, you know, aqtul wada and aqtul, yeah. I won't say
I had
anything.
a separate question, if you don't mind bringing it.
But I mean, just to complete his thought, sorry, Taser. I mean, maybe what you're referring to is asalatul wujud and asalatul mahiyya, this whole debate, what's principial in terms of reality?
yeah.
You know, and then there's the whole debate on that. And, you know, for most, you know, I mean, there's definitely one school will say existence of an object is principial, right? But the question here is that, I mean, you know, so the question here is that when, like, if we look at any object in nature, any object in reality, right, we have to account for two things, two fundamental questions that guide our inquiry. Like, we have to provide an account of things, right? And in order to fully account for a thing, we have to answer two questions. One of them is, you know, the existence of the thing, right? And the second is, because if it's there, then what's brought it into existence, right? Then the second question we have to ask here is, what is that thing? In other words, and that's the first question deals with existence, and the second question deals with the essence, right? Now the question arises here is that, okay, well, what's principial? What's more primary, you could say, you know, and the asalatul wujud, asalatul mahiyya question, which is, you know, some schools will say it's the essence that's being it's the essence that's being modified, and existence now is, right, modifying the essence. Other schools will say, a thing exists first, and it's the existence of that thing that's being modified, and the essence modifies this. Now these are all conceptions, these are all ideas and, you know, distinctions that are made in the mind, in the intellect, right? Outside, right, externally speaking, right, and they're identical. Existence and essence will be identical, according to some schools I'm talking about here. So, but now, having said that, would that change this issue of universals? Do they exist or do they not? I don't think so, because at least at the outset, you know, I don't think so, because when you're still accounting for a thing, you have to account for its existence and you have to account for its essence, right? If universal, you know, the idea of a kulli, of a universal, as described here, if it's of the concept of the thing in the mind, right? I mean, that process of abstraction and that whole predicating universality of Zayd, of Amr, or of insan, of concepts like insan, hayawan, those are all acts that take place in the mind, according to this particular school, like Avicenna school and these Ash'ari theologians here, right? So that wouldn't, I think, at least initially, doesn't seem like it would change this around, because after all, like Avicenna, who did hold his positions, this is his account of universals. So he didn't see that as posing a problem, I would say, or changing the whole thing around.
Yeah, perhaps not on the question of like humanness or hoarseness, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, though. No, I think it's a great question.
To complicate things a bit, we were talking about a unit that before.
By all means, complicate.
No, I mean, so at least according to the Arabic, the unit that do not exist. They don't have the quality of existence.
External existence, yeah.
They're
Right.
not, neither exists nor exists, something like that.
No, but he'll say, يعني أشياء
in a way.
عدمية. Sometimes he'll just say they're non-existent things. عدمية is the exact term that he uses. But they are things nonetheless, right? So then, go into your question about which one comes first. So here you have some sort of, so you were referring to objects that have been brought into existence, and that's why.
Concrete existence.
Concrete existence.
Correct,
okay,
yeah.
if we can use that distinction. But here you also have things that, quote unquote, don't exist, right?
Like what?
Thabita that we were talking about, right? They don't exist according to Nawawi.
Yeah,
They're not in existence.
They don't have concrete
They don't have
existence.
concrete
Yeah,
existence.
correct, yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, they don't have that quality of existence.
Correct, yeah.
But they don't have
seem to be-
absolute non-existence.
Huh?
But they don't have absolute non-existence.
No, they don't have absolute non-existence,
Yeah,
but
so
they
it has-
don't exist. They
yeah.
are ashya adamiyya, as Steve
Yeah.
terms,
But it still has a
No, but I think we have to keep, well, we have to keep our terms consistent here. So, because, yeah,
In the chamber.
yeah, because if we're saying, why do we say concrete existence? Because when you say something exists according to Ash'ari school, ma lahu tahaqquq fil kharij, right? So, and then,
And when you say something is ma'duma,
ma laysa lahu
adami,
laysa lahu
it's also
tahaqquq.
not adam.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is different, absolutely.
So we got to keep them consistent here, though, I think, yeah.
But the clearer usage of Sheikh Akbar's statements would be to say that it has taqdeer. This is what Abu Ghani Nablusi uses to talk about.
Yeah.
He says it has thubut and taqdeer as ayan thabita. Now, thubut and taqdeer is not ma'dum ma'at. It's not pure non-existence,
Right,
meaning
right.
mumkin, but it has taqdeer in the ilm Allah of God and not wujud khariji.
Not-
And so they
Yeah.
exist, okay, quotes, clear quotes there, they exist in the knowledge of God.
Right.
A better way to say that, they subsist in the knowledge of
Yeah.
God as objects of God's knowledge. So this way we keep us away from the idea of existence.
Existence, yeah, that's what we got to keep
They
it, yeah.
subsist in the knowledge of God as objects of His knowledge.
Yeah.
And that would include then ontologically all of the mumkin, the mawjud and the ma'dum.
But I do have to say something, Tisha, we'll get to your point, yeah. Just for the purpose of clarity, as we continue to ask these great questions, if you notice here, we're dealing at the level of theology, of ilm al-kalam. The moment you bring in, Sheikh al-Akbar, and I have to be honest here, I don't know why people just always have a tendency to bring him in. He's not dealing at the level of kalam.
Yeah.
And you're confusing
You can't
discourses.
solve the Kalam question
Yeah.
by bringing in a completely different discipline whose
Paradigm,
maqasid, yes, whose paradigm is, well, it's not different. It's just operating at a different level in what is an assumed hierarchy.
Correct,
But
yeah.
its maqasid are not the maqasid of kalam.
Correct, yeah.
Its preliminaries may be what kalam delivers to tasawwuf. It's preliminaries, but then it's going to other spaces. So, Omar, this is not where you're coming from, but we have seen a few instances where someone is putting down a kalam question, which is the bread and butter of kalam's work, but then bringing in another discipline and saying this other discipline is going to solve the question, maybe from the perspective of what that other discipline is interested in, but you haven't solved it. They haven't solved the kalam question.
Correct, yeah.
So,
And keeping those discourses in mind, not discourses, disciplines in mind, it's extremely important because we're trying to, for example, understand something that's described as experiential, dhawqi in nature, the ayanu thabita. We're trying to understand this with our intellects. And that's not the faculty that's being used here in the ayanu thabita. And we're not going to get far, is my point, yeah.
that's a beautiful point to make.
Yeah, so we should
And
keep,
I hope that
yeah.
we're able to highlight that in our follow-up work.
Yeah,
That's how everybody's weighed in on this.
excellent. Sir Taysir, you were waiting patiently.
Yeah, and no worries, and I also don't want to keep people, so
Yeah.
I'm worried that I'm.
Taysir, you have the floor.
So I think I just want to wrap back because maybe I was reading their text wrong. So when I read, you and I have had a conversation about these texts before, but it sounded to me like the mutakallimin were not saying that the tabi'a kulli was something that was originating from the concept, but that it existed in the particular itself, especially since they're kind of aware of the difference between abstracting something from like a relational term, right? Like it's kind of a relate, like you have fatherhood, you know, you have the father and the son, and then you're abstracting that out, versus something that's, you know, in the actual particular that exists extramentally.
Yeah.
So is that just like a difference of reading of what they're saying? Or because in the conversation that happened maybe about 30 minutes ago when you were talking to Chef Jihad, you know, you were saying kind of, he called it, I think, the circuit. So you have like, you know, the human, you're abstracting out humanness, you have the concept of a human, and then you have like ma sadat alayhi back to the human. So, I mean, wouldn't it be the case that there's like a possible reading of what they're saying, that the kulli tabi'i already exists in the human, whether or not you recognize the concept of the kulli?
I think that, you know, that's where there's a debate on, but a group of theologians would say yes. I think Avicenna himself would say yes, and many of the Ash'ari theologians would say yes to that question too, and others
Would say that.
yeah, would say no, you know, yeah, I would say that's kind of where there is a dispute, you know, amongst in the school of on that question, you know.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like a, you know, yeah, so it's that's where the whole discussion's on.
Yeah, about
Yeah.
how to make sense of them saying that, right?
Correct, yeah.
Because it just
But-
sounds to me like they have the language to say it's i'tibari. They have the enough tools to make that clear to us that they
Yeah.
didn't mean that there was something,
Yeah,
like it would be strange for them not to make that clear, given how clear of people they are.
yeah.
To kind of avoid clarity on that question would seem almost.
Yeah, and you know, so one way that scholars have understood, when those scholars maintain that this is a juz min haywan, like
Right.
that it's a part of this human, is that some of them have said it meaning that it's a juz akli. It's an you know, I don't know how to translate it correctly, rational type of, you know, part, you know. It's a distinction that's made.
Distinction of reason.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a distinction of reason. So, and when they'll say, so you see, for example, you know, you'll see George out there and he says he's a human, and then you say animality is part of George, right? Meaning here is that he's a body. He's, you know, jism, nami, mutaharrak, but you know, he moves by his own volition, all of those type of things. And when we say animality is part of George, that's what we really mean here. But it's a juz akli, and that's how some have understood it that way. I've even asked, so some readings of Aquinas are very similar to Avicenna's position, right? And I've asked them, Thomas, like, how do they really understand this particular, you know, how does Thomas, you know, explain this? And they themselves were kind of also, you know,
Perplexed.
yeah, they're perplexed. Well, you can read it this way, you can read it that way, and things like this. And so we've had a couple of hours under our belt discussing how even Aquinas has understood this, because he pretty much took the identical position as Avicenna did. He wasn't happy with Aristotle's position on this. And so, but how do you understand it? Because some of Aquinas' texts do say it exists as a universal, externally, which kind of causes, okay, this is a different ontology now, right? To say that a universal could exist extramentally. And then there are other passages, they're like, no, you have to read it in light of other passages, and then it kind of gives a more Avicenna interpretation to it, you know? So it's a bit unclear here. And that's why, so they describe, I think I wrote it here, they describe Aquinas' position as this type of, so he says here on page, second page, he goes, Aquinas explains two ways in which a nature or essence may be considered, according to its proper content, and according to the existence the essence has in an extramental particular. Right, and then he goes on, and so this is what's called, he says, essences exist in particulars in an individuated manner, not in a universal matter.
Right.
For the moderate realist, essences qua essence are neither universal nor individual. Universality and individuality are secondary intelligibles, that's what we would agree with that, I think, added to the essence qua essence. So, yeah, it's really, yeah, it's, so this is a reading of Aquinas, though. It's not, there are other readings of him on this issue. So, So, yeah.
You want to conclude before I
Yeah, yeah.
let you close out,
Yeah.
and before we decide to close out, what was our timetable for this session?
We have 7 minutes remaining.
Oh,
Okay, so let's do this. Let's let Omar make some closing remarks, and then I'll say a few words.
yeah, exactly. So, just something to think about. We don't have to discuss it, at this point, but, some contemporary analytic metaphysicians, E.J. Lowe, I particularly find him useful, and so in his discussion on universals, when he's trying to define particulars and universals, it's a very interesting definition. So he gives one way of distinguishing between universals and particulars is the spatiotemporal account, where he says is that up there? Okay. He says particulars are distinctive in being individuated by their spatiotemporal locations. So when we say something's a juz'i, we're defining it in spatiotemporal terms, right? No two particulars can exist in exactly the same place at the same time, and no single particular can exist in two wholly distinct places at the same time. So if that's your definition of a particular, well, then a universal, right, will also be defined spatiotemporally then, right, contra to a particular though, right? Another understanding of universals and particulars is through, let's define them through this idea of instantiation, right? So every particular instantiates, meaning it's an instance of a universal. Now if that's our definition, then we can say a particular then is an entity which cannot itself be instantiated by another entity. A universal can be instantiated, but a particular cannot be instantiated. So then, if that's a particular, a universal, therefore, is an entity which can not only instantiate another entity, but can also be instantiated by another entity, meaning it can have instances. Now, there are problems with this because if you're defining universals in terms of it is instantiated, the question is, are there properties of universals which lack instantiations? And he does resolve that saying, universals can be instantiated. It doesn't mean they have to be instantiated, because in our typology of universals, I think I have it here. This is standard books of logic. We have 6 types of universals, right? In regards to their instantiation and things like that, So that, just to leave you with, contemporary conversations on universals, right? They're looking at the same issue, right? But in these ways, Now, I haven't found discussions, and maybe Dean, if do contemporary metaphysicians, the ones that you mentioned today as well, do they talk about processes of abstraction and hadful mushakhasat and things like of
Do they talk about hadful mushakhasat?
Sorry.
That would be surprising.
Well, you did good because you understood juz aqli. You understood juz aqli. I was like, okay, this is great.
I could tell where you were going.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
These are mind-independent things.
Yeah.
They're language independent. We can just glom onto them.
Yeah. But this idea of abstraction, as we talked about it this afternoon, kind of what happens, I don't know if they'll say with the soul, as we would, the language we have here, but at least what the mind does. Are they writers on that?
Yeah. So the paper that I gave you, is all about universals and nominalism, realism and nominalism in the 20th century up to now, and the nominalists, they don't focus so much on what our minds are doing when we categorize.
Okay.
But they take things that we think are true about categories.
Yeah.
There's the red things, and there's the dogs, and there's the horses, and so on. And they ask, okay, what are we saying when we say they have something in common?
Yeah.
And the nominalist tries to ground that in similarities among particulars, so that you don't have this extra thing.
Correct.
And of course, they're all going to think we have concepts in our minds. We have the concept of horse, we have the concept of round things, and so on. And I think there's a little bit more of a division of labor in contemporary
analytic philosophy where you think, okay, the philosophy of mind and psychology itself, the discipline of psychology, is going to tell us how the mind notices similarities and picks out common features of things and so on. Whatever it says, then we're still going to have to be able to say, as philosophers, what it is for things to have something in common.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a little bit of a division of labor
Okay. Yeah.
between those two strategies. Where I think in St. Thomas and Avicenna, you're kind of combining the jobs, because they're doing everything. They have to do everything. They have to do biology.
Yeah.
They have to do
Medicine,
medicine.
psychology.
Yeah. So they're kind of doing it all at once, and I think that's a big difference.
Yeah, I
But
see.
it doesn't. What really strikes me is how well or how closely a bunch of positions here that, insofar as I'm understanding them, they map onto current debates just so well. And if they don't quite, well, that's an opportunity to fiddle with the machinery and show where there's a subtle difference.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised because Aristotle's logic and the Stoics with their logic is in the background of all of this.
Yeah.
So it really is. It seems to me familiar, but in a slightly different key, a different some slightly different alternatives.
Yeah. That's great. No, that's really helpful. I definitely want. Yeah. I'll get some of the sources from you
But
later on.
Lowe's kind of project, the distinctions he's making there between different things you could mean by universal. And
Sure.
Russell.
Yeah.
Russell was basically using the same things, and then you've got Aristotle's predicable of many is what a universal is.
Sure. Yeah.
That hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
And it's different conceptions of universals are very much on the table, and there's a lot of discussion.
Yeah. From our authors here, I think, to kind of close up, we could definitely say, like, some takeaways, from this particular tradition is that, the mind does form concepts. These concepts, after the process of, undergoes this process of abstraction, they do believe that essences can be arrived at, and we know essences, and the essence itself, like animal itself, is, and whether it's universal or particular, those are things that come after, the conception or the formation of an essence. And universality and particularity are not, they're not speaking about how terms are used, they're speaking about how concepts are being predicated. And that I think we could take away with, and I think that's a lot of room to guide us in our conversations and our further discussions, like what's happening psychologically and kind of updating things, in that way, I think will be. So why do we group things together, natural objects? At least it's because they have a common nature, is what we would say. And it's not just because they have a common term. We don't share the term male or human in common. It's, that's not why we're grouped together. It's because we have a common nature or essence.
Toxic masculinity.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll end with that. Sheikh Jad.
Depending on who you ask.
Yeah, Michelle. Yeah.
So.
Alhamdulillah.